Hey guys, this is the Great Depression causes and the effects of it. So first off, just to recap, the Republican presidents take over in the 1920s, a very laissez-faire approach to the economics. So we have Warren G. Harding, who wins in 1920 after Wilson had two terms. This kind of ends the progressive era. So he uses the radio and says he wanted a return to normalcy. Normalcy actually wasn't a word; he invented it after World War One. He had a very corrupt administration. His administration was involved in the Teapot Dome scandal, where the Navy oil reserves were sold to oil companies for bribes, and his Secretary of the Interior, Albert Falls, was arrested for it. He got his girlfriend pregnant and actually hid her away in Atlantic City. All of this culminated. A couple other corrupt things were going on, and he suddenly died of a heart attack in 1923. Was it due to the scandals? We don't know. Calvin Coolidge takes in, and he's the total opposite of Warren G. Harding. He is proper, he's quiet, he's a good politician, very business friendly, and not the most talkative guy, but he got the job done. He was a vice president. He took over when Harding died. His nickname was Silent Cal. One funny story is he was at a dinner. A woman came up to him and says, "I bet I can make you say more than three words." And he coolly replied, "You lose," and walked away. His famous saying was, "The chief business of America is business." He didn't want the government to get involved in it or get in its way. So he is going to take all the regulations that were put in place in the progressive era and get rid of them. And he's going to lower the tax rates for the richest people and corporations so they'll have more money to spend and grow, and this will help the economy go. It's called supply side economics. We also call it trickle down theory, where you give higher tax cuts to the wealthy, and that money will eventually trickle down to the bottom because they are the job makers. And you got to look up why he helped fund Mount Rushmore. It's a pretty funny story. He went to visit there and he fell in love with South Dakota. I think it's South Dakota. I always get those confused. But check it out. Take a look at it. That's Warren G. Harding. That's his wife, not his girlfriend, who was hid away, of course, in New Jersey. This is Teapot Dome scandal, which dealt with oil steamrolling over some White House officials. That is Calvin Coolidge, who's the former governor of Massachusetts, and that is Mount Rushmore, which he helped provide funding for. Election 1928 was a no brainer. First off, Herbert Hoover is an extraordinary man. He was an engineer, made millions of dollars. He was the head of the Food Administration, he was the head of the commerce during Harding and Calvin Coolidge's presidency. He was actually a pretty remarkable guy. Rags to rich story. He's actually really incredible, but he's going to get the blame for the Great Depression. We'll see if he earns that moniker. His slogan in 1928: "A chicken in every pot, a car in every garage." He wants America to be as successful as possible. And when he accepted the nomination to be the Republican presidential candidate, his speech was, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of this land. We shall soon, with the help of God, begin to set a day when poverty will be banished from his land." And during 1928, absolutely correct. By 1933, 1 in 4 Americans are going to be impoverished and unemployed. He ran again Al Smith of New York. What's remarkable about him, he is the first Catholic president. He was against prohibition. He thought it was a terrible idea. And he represents Tammany Hall, still around at that time. He's going to lose because, again, Herbert Hoover is an incredible guy. Number two, definitely some racism towards, or not racism, prejudice towards Catholics at that time. They still didn't trust Irish Catholics even in 1928. Uh, this is was what, 80 years after the potato famine, and still Irish Catholics aren't getting a lot of love. There's Herbert Hoover standing next to Babe Ruth. 1929, a reporter asked Babe Ruth if he felt okay that he got paid more than the president, and he smoothly replied, "I had a better year than him." And you'll see why he had such a terrible year. So let's get to the reasons for the Great Depression. You don't have to obviously copy this down, but these are the reasons why we have the Great Depression. It's a culmination of things, and this is what it led to, the effects. So, first one, credit. Americans start buying all these products on installment plans. In the 1920s, you learned about the radio and the Model T and the phones and everything made out of electronics. and they were expensive. Americans didn't have cash for it, so they started buying it on credit or installment plans. And by 1929, the debt that Americans had, it was 6 times higher than 1915. So we have a lot of Americans with tons of debt. And when people have a lot of debt, um, it's going to diminish their ability to purchase things. And when people stop buying stuff, that's going to slow the economic progress because businesses aren't going to make money, they're not going to expand, and they're not going to keep a large workforce. So you start laying people off. They don't have any money. They can't purchase stuff, and you see this vicious cycle. The reason why people are buying stuff on credit is because the Federal Reserve, developed under Wilson's administration, has interest rates really low. So if the loans are really low, people have more incentive to take out debt to purchase some of these things. So this promotes business. And in the 1920s, it's all about business. Chief business of America is business. So they want business to boom. Number two, the stock market. All throughout the 1920s, we have a bull market. A bull market is when stock prices keep rising and rising and rising. So if you invested $10 and then the next year that stock went up to $20, you're making money, and you're going to feel like every year it's going to go higher and higher. So you're going to invest more and more of your money. Now, only 2% of the US actually invest in the stock market. How could this drag down the whole economy? I'll show you in a second. The big problem with the stock market was stock speculation. People were buying and selling to make a very quick profit. And what happened is this drove up demand for stocks, and this inflated the prices of stocks. So people were buying stocks that were maybe 100, 120, 200% higher than the true value of the stock. So, say the stock was only worth $100. People were willing to pay $300, $400 for it. And when it came back to reality, they had overspent, and all their money is going to be wasted when the money comes down to the true value. The other thing is businesses are cooking their books. They are having inaccurate books. They're saying they're making so much profit, but in reality, they were not. So people had a idea that they're purchasing a good quality stock from a good business, but that business actually was floundering at that time. It's now illegal. You can't do that. Now, the biggest problem, this is what's going to affect the whole country, this idea of margin buying. This is purchasing stocks with borrowed money. So it's kind of like buying stocks with a credit card. You're going to pay that money back. So essentially, how it worked was you would pay 10% on a stock and you would borrow the rest. So, say I bought that one share for $100. I would put $10 down, and then I would borrow 90 bucks from the bank. And then eventually I would have to pay that bank back the principal, which is $90 plus interest. Now, if the stocks go all the way down and you sell your stocks, say for only like $40, now you still owe the bank $90, but you only got $40 back. How the heck are you going to pay that back? And we'll show how that affected the rest of the economy in a second. So what happened is Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929, the stock market had a major crash. Okay. People were spooked, but the next day on Friday, things came back to normal. The stock prices went back up. On the weekend, they don't trade. On Monday, again, things were normal. It looks like, it was a little blip on Thursday. But then on Tuesday, investors panicked and they sold off a lot of their stocks. And as a result, the stock market crashed. And just like we said, this one person had a $100 stock, only put $10 down, borrowed $90, and all of a sudden that stock dropped down to $30, $40, they wouldn't be able to pay the banks back. And if the banks can't get their money back, the banks take that money from depositors, and they wouldn't be able to give the money back to the people who had safely put their money in the banks. All right, so we'll see that in a second. But let's take a look at how inflated the stocks were. 1929, GE, General Electric, Thomas Edison's former company that JP Morgan had consolidated. It was selling at $396 for one share. In 1932, 3 years later, it was selling for a measly $34. That's how inflated the stocks were. US Steel, Andrew Carnegie's former company that JP Morgan also consolidated, selling at $260 for one share, and now only selling for $21 in 1932. It became a bear market. A bear market is when the stock market loses 20% of its highest number. So let's say 1929, it was rising up because it was a bull market. All of a sudden, it dropped 20%. It's now in a bear market. 2020, we had our first bear market in 10 years with the 2020 coronavirus panic. This is a cool video that shows you about the stock market crashing and how it had a devastating effect on the rest of the economy. You only have to watch the first 6 minutes. Here's the Brooklyn Daily Eagle: Wall Street in panic as stocks crash. $30 billion in one day is extraordinary. This is the stock market, Wall Street, New York. No bull yet. That comes a little bit later. Reason number three, we're in a Great Depression, or it starts the Great Depression. European war debts. We have the Treaty of Versailles. Germany has all these massive debts. France still has massive debts. England has massive debts. And if they have debts, they stop importing US goods, especially US farm products. The US farmers are going to experience the Great Depression way before everybody else in the United States. And another problem with it is America decides to use protective tariffs again. We had lowered our tariffs under the Wilson administration, but we're going to raise them to a pretty high level, one of the second or third highest levels of all time in the Smoot-Hawley tariff. When they raised their tariffs, we weren't buying European goods. Europeans decided to put high protective tariffs. And essentially, the global economy shrunk because nobody was trading with each other because of these high protective tariffs. Number four, conservative policies. There are no regulations on businesses that time. Laissez faire, progressivism tried to put these guidelines on businesses. In 1920s, we're looking away. The economy's doing so well. Who cares if some businesses are cheating a little bit? So they looked away. No regulations, cut all the red tape. Number two, we have the tax cuts, the trickle down theory, also known as supply side economics. So the idea is that if you cut taxes for the wealthy, they'll build businesses, they'll hire more people, and that money from the tax cuts will trickle down to people below them. The problem is that money is then stripped away to build more roads, maybe as social welfare programs, or to help regulate these businesses to make sure they're not being mismanaged or doing something illegal. We also have the reduction of the power of labor unions. Labor unions were categorized as socialistic or communistic, especially with the Red Scare going on. When the power of labor unions is reduced, they can't argue for higher pay. If they don't get higher pay, that affects the purchasing power of most Americans. That means it's harder for middle class and working class Americans have to have enough money after they pay all their bills to purchase more stuff. So it actually lowered the wages for most Americans with the reduced power of labor unions. And with these high protected tariffs that raise the prices on everything because there's less competition in America. So you had to pay for more expensive American goods instead of having more competition from global countries and global competition. So all of this together, the stock market, the European war debts, the credit crunch, conservative policies, these all factor into the Great Depression. And there's just an example of the trickle down theory. If you cut taxes for the wealthy, that money will eventually trickle down. But as you can see, it doesn't really trickle down to the bottom ladder of our economy. And here's just kind of a modern day image of trickle down theory or supply side economics. And you can take a look at that later. The last reason is overproduction. One, we have farmers; they are overproducing. The same problem we see with the populist and the people of that time period. The farmers started doing really well during World War One because the war was going on. They couldn't focus. Europeans couldn't focus on their crops, so they had to rely on American crops. So that was awesome. But the problem is, after the war was over, they went back to their farms, and farmers kept producing at a high rate. Europe stops buying, so we have a huge surplus, and demand drops. That's going to lower the prices of crop goods, and as a result, they're going to be in massive debt. This debt is going to lead to them not being able to pay their mortgages, so they're going to lose their homes and their farms. So they're the first one to suffer in the 1920s and the first ones to experience the depression before the stock market crash in 1929. We also have industry who's doing mass production. The idea of Henry Ford doing the assembly line and mass producing cars, well, that's great. It lowers the prices, but when you produce so many of these things and people stop buying, how many cars can one family have? Businesses are going to start laying off people to compensate for the lack of income they're getting in or lack of revenue they're getting in. So overproduction was also a major factor in leading to this Great Depression. So all this comes together. The stock market crash is kind of like the short-term calls that kind of put everything into focus. The first thing fact that we have is bank failures. So a lot of borrowers, especially people who were buying on margin, defaulted on their loans, meaning they couldn't pay their loans out. Where do banks get these loans? They get their loans from money that we put into the banks. So they're actually using other people's money to give these loans out. Hopefully, giving a loan out to somebody who's responsible and will pay it back. But when it's never get paid back, the banks have no money. There's no capital in the banks. There's no cash reserves, and this this is troublesome for most American 98% of Americans who did not invest in the stock market. And there was no protections against your bank accounts back then. So if a bank closed up, you can lose all your life savings. You could be 65 years old, ready to retire, and you have I don't know $100,000 in the bank that could all be lost if that bank closed. So what happened was a rumor went on. If you got to watch that video, people heard that banks didn't have their money because of the stock market and buying at margin. So there were these major bank runs where people were running to withdraw all their money from the bank. Now, this is also problematic because if everybody removes their money from the banks can't give any loans. If you don't have any loans, people can't take out mortgages for houses. You can't send a kid to college by using loans because there are no banks to give out loans. You can't run a business and take a loan out to start a McDonald's or some other business that you might have. This is really problematic if people take all their money out of the banks. And in a 3-year span, 1930 to 1932, 5,000 banks fail. There are about 20 states that don't even have banks. I think that's the number they gave in that video. Multiple states that don't have any banks at all. So this is an example of a picture, people running to withdraw all their money from the banks. And this is a wonderful movie. It's called It's a Wonderful Life. It's an excellent movie I was showing in economics class. It's a guy who just got married. He's about to go on his honeymoon, finally leave Bedford Falls, New York. But there's a bank run on his bank, and this is how he handles it. Watch the clip if you have a little bit of time. Number two, business failures. People have no money to buy products because they're in debt. They don't have anything else to do. They can't get loans from banks because banks are closed. So the first thing a businesses do is they lay off their employees. The problem is when you lay off your employees, people don't have paychecks. If they don't have paychecks, what can't they do? They can't purchase stuff. So that's going to drive other business to fail as well. As you can see, it's a very vicious cycle, and it's tough to get out of an economic depression. The gross national product, today we call it the GDP or the gross domestic product. It's the total value of all goods and services produced in a year. Goods meaning like, cars that we produce. Services, think of like a cloud system that we have, like Apple and Amazon and all these, then Google have cloud systems. It's not a good, but it's a service. That would also be counted towards the GDP. 1929, we had a GDP of 103 billion. 4 years later, we are cut in half. So you can see our business is not really producing anything, no goods or services. 1930, 1931, more than 50,000 businesses went bankrupt. The unemployment rate goes from 3% in 1929. Hoover saying we're the closest to not having poverty ever again. By 1932, 1 in 4 people are unemployed. Joblessness. So we have 1.5 million are unemployed. 1933, we have 15 million people unemployed. People don't have money, and because they don't have jobs, they can't pay their bills. So a lot of them lose their houses. Some abandon their families. It's a pretty miserable thing. And Hoover is the guy who changes it from having a panic, right? That's what they used to call economic depressions. He changed it to depression because he thought it sounded better. Panic sounded bad, depression. But obviously, in our modern time, depression is also something that we kind of mash together with mental issues. Now, for the people who do get to keep their jobs, they either have decreased wages. So if you're making like $2 an hour, now you're going to get $1 an hour. Or you have decreased hours. Instead of working 60 hours a week, maybe you're going to work 20 hours a week. African Americans are usually the first workers to be fired during this time period, showing the racism of the time. Famous picture from this time period, a stockbroker who lost everything on the stock market, willing to, sell this car that was way more expensive than a Model T, maybe $2,000. He's willing to sell it for 100. It's that Model T. Look at the difference between the two. Uh, some people became hobos, sleeping on park benches because they were homeless. These are people trying to get a job, laid off, trying to look for a job. Say there was 3 jobs available, you have 1,000 people trying to go for that job. Here's some of the images. People would just wander from town to town looking for work, and this is a sign in one of the towns: "Jobless man, keep going. We can't take care of our own." These two men are walking down the street in Chicago with their resumes. Some of these guys are war veterans, they're family men, they're accountants, they have experience, and they're trying to get a job anywhere they can. One of the most successful ways to make money during the Great Depression when you're unemployed was to sell apples. Washington State had a surplus of apples right at this juncture during the Great Depression, and they helped feed a lot of people during that time period and help pay for a lot of people to be able to pay their bills. There's a famous image of a migrant mother, a woman in the West who's going from farm to farm, seeing if she can get a job as a day laborer for a couple bucks while dragging 3 of her children around. And look at the desperation that she has on her face. Sad times. These are the bread lines and the soup kitchens that are going to be opened up by the Salvation Army and other services of that time period to help people get some food because food was scarce. I think this is kind of ironic. World's highest standard of living. Look at this happy family in their car with a dog, and then you have these African Americans who are the unemployment line. There's no way like the American way. This is Al Capone's soup kitchen that he opened up in Chicago to help feed people while he was doing pretty well with his gangster anti prohibition speakeasies, etc. And look at these men's faces, how emaciated they look while they're just getting a basic piece of bread and some soup just to survive the day. These are called Hoovervilles. All right, these are shanty towns that were developed all over parks and all over the place. They would have scrap wood and any materials they could to build a house because they were evicted from their homes because they didn't have money to pay the rent. Here is a Hooverville, all right, a bunch of Hoover that they named after the president at that time period. A bunch of houses that they built in a park. I think it's not Central Park. I think this is out in Seattle, Washington. Here's another image of men scrounging around to help develop their own house. And I believe that is it. Hope you enjoyed and have a great day.